Please go on.
To Josh's point, I think there's a short and then there's a long-term view on this. And I absolutely agree, we need the data. Some of our research at ISD slightly hits up against the findings that you have. And we have computational analysis of threat actors like extremist groups and hostile state actors, the Kremlin, the CCP, and so on and so forth. And there's three things that are happening that we see really having an impact on the polarization dynamic, having an impact on views. One is that, by and large, the platforms are still failing to enforce their own rules in terms of terrorist and violent extremist content, hate speech, in terms of disinformation, information operations, inauthentic coordinated activity. And we've got tons of evidence to show that that's happening. Worse still, we do find that the content that comes closest to the red line, over and over, both evidenced by their own studies, sometimes leaked into the public domain by whistleblowers and through our own research, that content does tend to get the most traction. And so you have not a kind of free speech environment, not a level playing field for speech and competition of ideas. You have a distorted speech environment in which the most sensationalist, the most extreme views tend to get hypercharged over other things. That's a curated speech environment in which essentially the business model, which is an attention economy business model, there to make sure that you're on the platforms buying stuff longer, dominates over safety or democracy concerns. So I will say, I think we've seen over the last decade, and I've been working on this like 15, 17 years, a massive shift, huge scaling of the polarization problem. So in places like, for instance, Germany, we found in our polling that the people who primarily imbibe their information from social media tend to align with conspiracist thinking, with fringe party voting, with sometimes some of the extreme views across the political landscape. And the people who still trust mainstream media tend to do the opposite. So there is definitely more to this. And I will say one thing, the social media platforms are cutting their trust and safety teams, and they are shuttering data access. So it makes it harder and harder for independent researchers to get at this picture. We need more information, not less, more transparency, not less. That's I think, a really important part of how democracies need to respond.
Absolutely. And even if we build these virtuous social spaces, then there's these questions of rogue actors trying to exacerbate polarization online. Do you think they are responsible for polarization, Joshua?
So that's a good question and a very difficult question to answer. When we think about rogue actors, there's lots of different types of rogue actors, and Sasha's organization has done a tremendous amount of work characterizing what many of these foreign influence campaigns do. But we can also think about domestic rogue actors as well. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind on this, when we think about these kinds of influences, in particular, say, foreign influence campaigns are able to have, I mean, the word influence is baked right into it. One of the things that we find as researchers over and over and over again when we look at just about any behavior online is that it tends to follow what we call a power law distribution. So you end up with having not something that's sort of uniformly distributed across the or even normally distributed, but small numbers of actors who engage in high levels of whatever the behavior is we're looking, and lots of actors that engage in low levels of it. So for example, and this is much older data than what Sasha's working with now, but when we looked at the US 2016 elections and the very famous Russian troll attempt to interfere in that election, at that point in time, Twitter released all the tweets by all of the Russian trolls, and we had a survey that was in the field over the course of the election where we had people's Twitter handles, and so we were able, because Twitter data is public, we could collect every person, we knew everybody followed by everyone in our sample, and we were able to collect all the tweets by all the accounts they followed. So this was like 1.2 billion tweets, and we could look to see who was actually exposed to these tweets from these foreign influence campaigns. And what we found was like a massive confirmation of this power law idea. So at the headline number sounded like a lot. It was like an average of 4 to 5 tweets could have been in people's Twitter feeds per day. But it turns out that of that exposure, 1% of our sample accounted for 75% of those potential exposures. 10% of our sample accounted for 99% of it. And so what you end up happening is you have 90% of the sample that has sort of no exposure to this at all. It also turns out that when you compare a foreign influence campaign, like in that case, the Russians, that was actually pretty well funded and a lot of people involved with that. But you look at people's other sources of information, like sources of news or politicians, it's just a tiny amount of the information that everybody's getting.
Yeah, I would just reinforce what you're saying, which is the good news is that many of these information operations are unsuccessful in reaching massive amounts of people, and a lot of them are really about testing what might work to get out there. But I will say there's sort of 3 tiers of information operations coming from, let's say, hostile states. At the top of that sort of pyramid, if you like, is all of the sort of official accounts of state media and affiliated sort of, officialdom. That reaches a certain number of people, but now we've seen a lot of that being curtailed. The second tier are these sort of troll farms, but the third, and by far the most impactful in reaching massive amounts of people and engaging with them, are essentially domestic networks, often conspiracy networks, influencer networks, on which these states piggyback increasingly. And understanding those dynamics is very difficult because the attribution then back to the state actor is much harder. But those vast audiences that those networks engage with are really, really a challenge in terms of dealing with hostile influence. And it's a hybridized landscape. You can no longer really pick apart hostile state actor, extremist hate actor, conspiracy network information anymore. They're all sort of in these subcultures online, interacting and reinforcing each other. So it's becoming very, very hard to find ways to respond. But they are having impact in a number of different contexts. There's no question about that.
If I can just add one more thing on that. When we think about these influence campaigns, we can think about first-order effects and second-order effects. So first-order effects is the exposure to a tweet from a Russian troll actually going to change your mind? And in this study that I was telling you about, we found no relationship between being exposed to these tweets and changing your opinion on who you were going to vote for, whether you were going to vote, and your opinion on issues. But there's a very pernicious second-order effect here, which is that in the United States, in the aftermath of that election, we spent 4 years hearing about how the Russians had changed the outcome of the election, right? Now, part of that is because they got caught. Part of it is because it played into narratives that were helpful for people. But it helped to create this sense that US elections were fragile. And I think that in the long term, and because US elections actually are a pretty robust institution, and they're not that fragile, but in the long term, when we keep hearing these tales of influence campaigns and people being able to hack the system, it creates this like nagging underlying doubt about the sanctity of democratic institutions. And that's something that extremist groups and even mainstream political candidates can play into to sort of sow seeds of and I think that that's very dangerous for democracies in the long term. So we want to think of these in both the first order effects, which might be negligible, but also these potential pernicious second order effects.
Does this mean that we need a lot more digital literacy work?
I think there's no one silver bullet. I've talked about regulation. I think it's incredibly important. I think you also need to be equipping the public, but not just the public, all forms of institutions, the courts, the law enforcement, government, with the skills to be able to deal with our digital lives. And of course, everything from illegality to harm in the wider sense. Digital literacy, digital citizenship education is really where I think we need to be going, which is in part understanding, if you like, how to protect ourselves from these threats, which is one side of it, but also in part how to equip us with proactively creating the good, good spaces, positive, pro-social environments, democratic environments online. I love Deepti's work. It's so important to start to really define how do we create these, a good web, a place that we want to be, but also a democratic web, a web that incentivizes democratic participation and engagement. So we have to come at it from a supply and demand standpoint. We need to be thinking in a much more comprehensive way about how we approach these problems. I just want to say, I am also really optimistic. I think we've just seen the passing of landmark legislation with the DSA. We've got other countries doing similar things. We are starting to think really innovatively about what good might look like. I think it will be good business for those of you investing in tech to invest in safety by design over time, because people are starting to wake up to the real harms of this, and they won't allow for it long term. And so safety by design, I think, is starting to land as an idea. And we have to remember, we are in a geopolitical contest right now. The very survival of liberal democracy is in question. And the internet is the arena in which that battle is being played out. Authoritarian states are very well aware of that and invest heavily in shaping our information ecosystem in their image. And we must do the same. So we need a vision for a democratic web. We all have a role to play here. In each of your companies, don't just think about digital literacy for kids. Adults, continuous learning. How is this ecosystem evolving? We need to be doing this work. We can all contribute to that.
Do you think there could be regulation with horizontal rules with this safety by design? I was talking with a French lawmaker the other day who was telling me that she wanted this at the European Union, to have this safety by design rule, just as if when we do drugs, before selling drugs, then we test them to make sure that there is no issue when we'll be selling them. So do you think this could be something to put forward?
I think it's part of the principle of the DSA, which is essentially it's a risk-based approach. When you develop a technology, a business, or any form of business, you should be responsible for thinking through the risks to society, to safety of your product. And essentially it's just asking of the tech sector the same set of requirements that we ask of almost, I think, every other sector that I can think of. So yes, safety by design, I think, should become both a regulated and a sort of norm, a requirement as we think about good engineering practices and so on.
Are you doing risk analysis?
Well, no, I wanted to add that I think safety by design is a really important piece of it, and there's infrastructure being built to support entrepreneurs and investors to kind of embed it into their work. I also do think that we need to innovate different sorts of business models. We need different sorts of incentive structures that govern and incentivize the behavior on a social platform. And really, I think that VCs, looking for the hockey stick growth trajectory puts pressure on social innovation to prioritize growth and engagement, when in fact we do want them to be taking into consideration these kind of long-term systemic issues. And so that sort of innovation in both the capital structures but also the business models feels really, really important.
And to take your drug analogy, I think this again comes back to a point we were talking about at the beginning, which is DSA, landmark legislation requiring data to be shared. But there are potentially ways to interpret this in a much more drug-based manner, which is the way we test drugs is we do these with randomized control trials. We use experiments. And the thing that's possible about this is we know the platforms conduct tons and tons and tons of experiments before they roll out new features. This data exists, the infrastructure exists. It's just that at this point in time, the only way those tests ever get showed to the public is if they're leaked. Right? And so it seems to me that there is a world here where we get at the very spirit of what you're talking about, that we want to test things when they come out. The platforms are already doing this, but this is where regulation could play a huge role, is that to surface these tests, and even better, to get people who aren't employees of the platforms designing the tests, and when they're out, publishing them and putting them in the public domain so that our regulators can be informed by them so that we can have this kind of system. And so the pieces are there in place. What we kind of need is the political will to move it forward, and we're closer than we've ever been, I think, in this regard. And so that's another role I think that all of you can play, especially those of you who are in Europe at European companies and working, as part of this process as the DSA rolls these things out.
So shall I be a venture capitalist at Vivatech and want to fund in a company doing social virtuous spaces? I should look at the fact that they do risk analysis and work on the externalities they deliver as well.
Yeah, I think the most important thing, I mean, for companies as well as being an informed public, is to understand the distinction between anecdotal descriptions, which is what we get in the media, what we get on talk shows, and rigorous research. And I think that, we need to prioritize the latter in informing our policy, but I think it can also give you, as entrepreneurs and investors, a real leg up in understanding how these systems work.